think that one of the most interesting ways to think about 12-tone music involves the relationship between the row and all of its many, many possibilities and the actual music that's created from that row, which may or may not reveal those possibilities, can sometimes even explicitly hide them. And at other times, the relationship might be one of suggestion. The music might hint at relationships that we could uncover as listeners or analysts. Anton Webern viewed this relationship between the 12-tone row and the actual music he composed as a metaphor. His music, he hoped, would be a mirror for the logic and the mystery of the natural world. He felt strongly that nature was governed by rules, natural laws that connected parts to wholes in a massive organic structure. But even though he believed in these natural laws, he didn't really think that we could ever quite understand them. And for him, that was actually part of the appeal. He wrote to his friend and fellow 12-tone composer Alban Berg in 1925 that it's not the beautiful landscape, the beautiful flowers in the usual romantic sense that moved me. My object is the deep, bottomless, inexhaustible meaning in it all. And this belief in the mystery of nature infused his understanding of 12-tone composition too. For instance, later in the same letter, he wrote to Berg, "The significance of the plants is unfathomable. That is the greatest magic to me. I perceive an unimaginable idea behind it. And I can say, to reproduce musically what I perceive there, for that I have struggled my whole life." And so when I listen to and analyze a piece by Webern, I like to look and listen in the way that he viewed nature, seeking out musical suggestions of the row's properties or deeper structures, even though I'm not sure I can entirely grasp them all. I think this idea of musical suggestion is really beautifully presented in Gelockert aus dem Schoße. This is the final movement of Webern's very last completed work. It was finished just before he died in 1945. The piece begins as a four-voice canon, whose leader is the tenor. This is also a mirror canon. The tenor and the bass each mirror each other around the note D, which is also the first note the tenor sings. The alto and sopranos are mirrors too, but around D's tritone, G sharp. Keep those notes in mind. They'll play a really important role later in the piece. When we hear the beginning, this sense of canon is pretty clear, I think. Much less obvious is a larger canon structure that organizes the whole movement from front to back. When we look at the end of Gelockert and compare it to the beginning, we can see that the altos and the tenors sing the same music, just backwards. The bass and the soprano have a similar relationship. So Webern's piece is not just a double mirror canon, it's also a retrograde canon as well. Now, for me, this larger canon structure is just not as easy to grasp perceptually. As a listener, it doesn't jump out to me in the same way that the mirror canon does. In fact, I'm not sure I really hear it at all. But Webern does do a number of things compositionally to suggest the presence of this deeper structure. And I want to concentrate on two of those things now. For instance, at the beginning of the piece, the tenor line carves out three major thirds surrounding its starting note D. And because the bass is mirroring the tenor, it does exactly the same thing, but singing a different row. So the F, D flat, C, E, and B, D sharp that begin the tenor are echoed in the bass by B, D sharp, E, C, F, D flat. That is, the bass does what the tenor did, but backwards. For me, this is a small musical hint, a suggestion of the big retrograde canon that lies behind the entire movement. My favorite example of this idea of musical suggestion happens in the very center of the piece. Webern has four different rows going on here, and all of them are part of the canon. But he manages to choose and combine these rows in just such a way that those three major thirds that we saw in the tenor and the bass at the beginning return here. But here, they're in all four voices and not just the lower ones. And at the exact center of the movement, the soprano leaps up to D natural. That note's really significant. It's the note that began the piece and the note that was the center of the two mirror canons. Here, it's the center of the movement's large retrograde canon. So something that was central at the beginning of the piece in determining the canonic mirror is now central in the middle of the piece in determining the retrograde structure. So in this movement, the row structure on canon may not be immediately clear to us as listeners, and I don't think that's something that Webern was aiming for. However, Webern has given us listeners and analysts a number of musical clues to latch onto. Those clues suggest the deeper underlying structures. For Webern, I think this was a metaphor for his view of the natural world. And for us as listeners, these musical clues give us a way into the music and into Webern's understanding of 12-tone composition.